The morning Pearl Talbot received the letter, she was elbow-deep in bread dough, and the ink had smeared so badly from the ride through the last rainstorm that she had to hold it up to the window just to make out the words. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything. The last real settlement before the cattle trails pushed south into Indian territory, and the first place a man coming north with dust on his boots and money burning his pocket might stop long enough to cause trouble. Pearl had lived here her whole life, all 24 years of it, and she had watched the town grow from a scattering of clapboard buildings around a single dry goods store into something resembling, if you squinted hard enough in the right light, a proper place where a person might want to build a future. She did not always squint in the right light. The letter was from her uncle, Theodore Talbot, who had moved out to Colorado 3 years prior and struck a modest but promising claim in the foothills near Pueblo. Theodore was the only family Pearl had left, her parents having both passed within 6 months of each other 2 winters ago, her mother to pneumonia, her father to the kind of grief that settles in a man's chest and simply squeezes until there is nothing left. Pearl had stayed on in the house, the small 2-room place at the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, paying what she could to old Harlan Webb, who technically owned the property, by taking in sewing and baking bread for the hotel dining room 3 mornings a week. It was a living, though barely. Theodore's letter, once she had puzzled through the smearing, informed her that he was not well. His lungs, he wrote, had been bothering him all winter, and the doctor in Pueblo had told him in no uncertain terms that he needed someone to help manage the house and the small parcels of work that still came in from the claim. He had no wife, no children, and Pearl was the only Talbot left in the world who might come. He was not asking her to move to Colorado permanently, he wrote, or at least he hoped it would not come to that. What he was proposing was a summer arrangement, June through September, to see him through the worst of it. He would pay her passage both ways and give her a fair weekly wage. Pearl set the letter down on the flour-dusted table and stared at the window, where the Kansas spring was doing its level best to look beautiful. The cottonwoods along the creek were just coming into leaf, pale green and trembling in a warm southern wind. A mockingbird was singing somewhere close. The problem was not the offer itself. The offer was generous and she cared for Theodore genuinely. The problem was Harlan Webb. Harlan Webb was 61 years old and had been widowed for 7 years. And for the past 18 months, he had been making a project of Pearl Talbot with the sort of methodical, unhurried confidence of a man who is entirely certain he will eventually get what he wants. He had raised her rent twice, the second time just last month, to a figure that made Pearl's careful arithmetic look very grim indeed. He had also, on 3 separate occasions, mentioned in a tone meant to sound casual that the rent might be arranged differently, should Pearl be inclined toward a different sort of arrangement altogether. Pearl had not been inclined. But she also had not been able to find another place to live, because Harlan Webb owned a substantial portion of the buildings on the north end of town, and the men who owned the rest were friends of his, and disinclined to cross him for the sake of a seamstress with no husband and no particular standing in the community. She had told herself that something would change. She had told herself this for 18 months. She picked up the letter again and read it twice more, and by the time the bread was ready to go into the oven, she had made a decision. She would write back to Theodore and accept, and she would leave for Colorado in 3 weeks. Harlan Webb could do whatever he liked with the house in her absence. When she came back in September, she would have wages saved, and she would find a different solution. What Pearl did not know, on that flour-dusted Tuesday morning, was that Harlan Webb had already found his own solution, and that it would be delivered to her front door by Friday evening. The man who delivered it was not Harlan Webb. The man who delivered it was Aaron Abbott. Aaron Abbott was 30 years old and had been in Caldwell for 8 months, which was long enough to have established a reputation, but not so long that anyone had started taking him for granted. He had come up from Texas the previous autumn with a trail drive he had been hired to boss, and when the cattle were sold and the other hands had collected their pay and gone looking for trouble or a train home, Aaron had stayed. He had bought a small parcel of land 3 miles east of town with a portion of his savings, built a one-room cabin on it over the winter, and put in a kitchen garden that people in town had privately thought would come to nothing. The garden had come to a great deal, in fact. Aaron had a methodical patience with growing things that surprised people who judged him first by his size, which was considerable, or by the worn colt on his hip, which was present but rarely mentioned. He was not a soft man exactly, but he was a careful one, and in a town like Caldwell in 1878, where men tended toward being loud and loose with both their money and their tempers, careful had a way of standing out. Pearl knew of him the way you know of anyone in a small town, by reputation and passing sight. She had seen him at the general store, and once at the hotel dining room where she delivered her bread. She thought of him, when she thought of him at all, as a quiet man who kept to himself and whose dark eyes had a way of watching things with a steadiness that was either very reassuring or slightly unsettling, depending on the day. On Friday evening, he knocked on her door. Pearl was at the table writing her letter to Theodore, and the knock startled her badly enough that she knocked over the ink bottle, and her first thought on opening the door was pure irritation at whoever had made her do that. Her second thought was considerably more complicated. Aaron Abbott was standing on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, and he was not meeting her eyes. He was looking at a point somewhere around her left shoulder, and his jaw was set in the particular way of a man who has made himself do something he would genuinely prefer not to do. "Miss Talbot," he said, "I am sorry to come by so late." It was not late. It was just past 7, and the spring light was still gold and long across the street. Pearl looked at him and then looked past him, as if expecting to see someone else, and when there was no one else, she looked back at him and waited. "Harlan Webb came to see me this afternoon," Aaron said. Pearl felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her face still. "Did he?" "He did." Aaron paused, and something moved across his expression that was not quite discomfort and not quite anger, but somewhere in between. "He told me that you have one night to consider a business proposition he is making. He said the proposition would be put to you formally in the morning, and that your answer needed to be given by tomorrow evening." "What sort of proposition?" Pearl asked, though she suspected she already knew the shape of it. Aaron looked at her directly for the first time, and his eyes were exactly as steady as she remembered. "He is offering to forgive the outstanding rent, and to reduce your payments going forward, in exchange for your agreement to marry him. He said he is giving you until sundown tomorrow to accept or refuse, and that if you refuse, he will move forward with an eviction." The cold thing in her stomach spread to her chest. "He sent you to tell me this," she said. "No," Aaron said. "He told me because I was there when he said it to another man, and I did not think it was right that you should hear it first in the morning when he shows up here with a witness and no warning. I wanted you to have the night to think." Pearl stared at him. The mockingbird had gone quiet. Down the street, someone was playing a fiddle badly outside the saloon, and the sound of it drifted up to them thin and slightly mournful. "That was kind of you," Pearl said, and she meant it, but her voice came out harder than she intended because she was working very hard not to let the fear show. Aaron nodded once. He turned his hat over in his hands. "I also wanted to tell you something else, Miss Talbot, if you will hear it." "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hat in his hands. Then he looked up at her again, and there was something in his face that she had not expected to find there, something raw and direct and completely unguarded. "I have a house," he said. "It is small, and it is only one room right now, but it is solid and it is mine outright. I have land and it is planted, and I have money saved that is not a fortune but is not nothing either. I am 30 years old and I have not been a perfect man, but I have tried to be a decent one." He stopped. He started again. I would like to ask you to consider marrying me instead." Pearl heard the fiddle down the street. She heard the wind in the cottonwoods. She heard nothing inside herself for a long and peculiar moment. "You do not know me," she said. "I know enough," Aaron said. "I have watched you this past year, Miss Talbot. Not in any wrong kind of way, I hope. But you work hard, and you are honest, and you are kind to people who do not always deserve it, and you have not complained once about a situation that any reasonable person would have good cause to complain about." He paused. "I should have come and talked to you months ago, and I did not, and that was my failing. I am here now." Pearl leaned against the doorframe because her knees were doing something unsteady. "You are proposing marriage to a woman you have never had a full conversation with." "Yes," Aaron said simply, "because of Harlan Webb. Because of Harlan Webb, and because I have wanted to speak to you for months and have not had the courage, and because this seemed like the kind of moment where a man either does the right thing or he does not." He looked at her steadily. "You do not have to say yes. I would not want you to say yes out of fear, but I wanted you to know that you have a choice that is not just between Webb and eviction." Pearl looked at him for a long time. The gold light was fading now, going to rose and then to lavender at the edges of the sky, and Aaron Abbott was standing on her doorstep with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had said everything he had to say and was now prepared to live with whatever came next. "Come in," Pearl said. "I have coffee on the stove, and I think we had better talk properly." He came inside and sat at her table, and Pearl noticed that he set his hat on his knee and looked at everything in her house with the kind of careful attention that is the opposite of being nosy, not prying but seeing. She thought that was interesting. She thought a great many things in the next hour were interesting. They talked. They talked longer than Pearl had expected, and differently than she had imagined a conversation with a near stranger could go. He told her about Texas, about the trail drives he had bossed for the past several years, about the land he had bought and why he had chosen Caldwell. He told her about his family, a mother in Tennessee who was still living, 2 brothers he had not seen in 6 years, a father who had died when Aaron was 16. He told these things without self-pity and without embellishment, just as facts, the way a man lays out tools before he starts a job. Pearl told him about Theodore's letter and about the Colorado offer. She told him about her parents, briefly and without going into the worst of it, and she told him about the sewing and the bread baking and the arithmetic that never quite worked. She told him that she had been angry for a long time and had been trying very hard not to be, because she did not see the use in it, but that sometimes it was difficult. He nodded at that like it was a thing he understood. By the time the coffee was gone and the light outside was fully dark, Pearl had learned the following things about Aaron Abbott. He was honest in a way that was not brutal but was consistent. He was funny in a quiet, dry way that she had not expected. He was serious about the land and what he was building on it. And he was looking at her across the table with an expression that had been respectful and patient and careful throughout the conversation, but that had underneath it something warm and complicated and entirely genuine. She also knew that he was afraid, under all the steadiness. She could see it in the slight tension around his jaw and the way his hand, resting on the table, had stayed very still all evening in the controlled way of a man keeping himself from fidgeting. He had come to her door and done a brave thing, and he was afraid she would send him away, and he was managing that fear with the same care he applied to everything else. Pearl thought she could spend a good long time learning the shape of a man like that. "I need to sleep on it," she said. "You said I have until sundown tomorrow." "You do," Aaron said. He stood, settling his hat onto his head. "Whatever you decide, Miss Talbot, I hope it is what you truly want and not what you feel you have to do." After he was gone, Pearl washed the coffee cups and sat back down at the table and looked at the unfinished letter to Theodore. Then she picked up the pen and wrote a different letter entirely, to a different address, and set it aside to be posted in the morning. She did not sleep much that night, but what sleep she did get was better than any she had managed in months. Harlan Webb arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning, as Aaron had predicted, and he brought with him a man named George Pell, who was a notary, and who had the deeply embarrassed look of someone who has been paid to witness something he would prefer not to think about afterward. Webb was not an unpleasant-looking man, Pearl had to admit that much. He was heavy-set, with a trimmed gray beard and the expensive clothes of a man who wanted people to know he had money. He was also, Pearl thought as she watched him come up her front path with his chest forward and his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, possessed of a fundamental certainty that the world was arranged for his convenience. He came inside when she opened the door, without being invited, and George Pell followed and stood near the wall looking at his boots. Webb laid out the proposal in precise and businesslike terms. He was a reasonable man, he said. He bore Pearl no ill will. She was a practical woman in a difficult situation, and he was offering her a solution. The house she was currently renting would become hers. Her debts to him would be cleared. She would have security and standing in the community. He would be a generous husband. Pearl let him finish. Then she said, "No thank you, Mr. Webb." There was a silence. "Miss Talbot," Webb said, and his voice had gone from reasonable to something that had gravel in it. "I would encourage you to think carefully." "I have thought carefully," Pearl said. "I have thought about it all night. The answer is no." "The rent," Webb began. "I know what the rent is," Pearl said, "and I know what the threat is. I will be out of this house within the week, Mr. Webb, and you will have it back to do with as you like. Good morning." George Pell was already moving toward the door. Webb stood for another moment with something dangerous in his eyes, and then the calculation that had always been behind those eyes finished its calculating, and he put on his hat and left without another word. Pearl stood very still in her kitchen until she heard the gate close, and then she sat down in the nearest chair and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. The answer was no. She had known it by 3 in the morning, sitting at the dark window with the quarter moon coming up over the cottonwoods. She had known it because the only future she could imagine with Harlan Webb was one where she spent the rest of her life being managed by a man who thought of her as a problem he had solved. And that image was so airless and gray that it made her chest ache just to hold it in her mind. And she had known the rest of it too, though she was still being careful with herself about it, turning it over like something that might be fragile. Aaron Abbott had sat at her table and talked to her like a person for 2 hours, and he had looked at her like he meant what he said, and she had not felt afraid once during the whole conversation. That was not nothing. She picked up the letter she had written the night before and read it again. It was addressed to Aaron Abbott, and it said, "I would like to see your land if the offer still stands. Come at noon if you are willing." She had not asked him to marry her in the letter. She had not said yes to anything, but she had written it at 2 in the morning with the window open and the spring air coming in cool and sweet, and it had felt like the truest thing she had written in a very long time. She sent it with the morning's bread delivery boy, and at noon exactly, Aaron Abbott rode up the north end of Main Street on a brown horse with a calm eye and tied it to the post in front of her house. Pearl was ready with her coat because the late morning had turned breezy, and she came out before he could knock, which made him smile in a way that changed his face considerably. It was not a careful smile. It was a quick and unguarded one, and she thought, "There you are." "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I told Harlan Webb no." "I heard," Aaron said. In a town like Caldwell, news traveled in the time it took for someone to walk from one end of Main Street to the other. "Are you all right?" "I am very well, actually," Pearl said, which was the truth and surprised her a little by being so. He helped her onto the horse she rode behind him, which in 1878 was entirely proper for an unmarried woman on a short daytime ride with a man she was considering, and Pearl noted that his hand on her arm when he helped her up was steady and warm, and immediately gone once she was settled, and they rode out east of town along the creek road, with the cottonwoods spreading new leaf above them, and the smell of mud and water and green things coming up from the banks. The land was 3 miles out, and in the spring it was frankly beautiful, though Pearl recognized that beauty and usefulness were different things, and tried to look at it with practical eyes. The creek curved through the southeastern corner of it, which was good for water. The cabin sat on a slight rise, which was good for drainage. The kitchen garden was laid out in careful rows on the south side of the cabin where it would get the most sun, and Pearl could see the early green of things already pushing up through the turned earth. She walked through the garden while Aaron stood back and let her look, which she appreciated. She walked around the cabin. Inside it was spare but orderly, a good stove, a solid table, 2 chairs, a bunk against the wall, a shelf of books. The books surprised her. "What do you read?" she asked. "History mostly," Aaron said. "Some natural science." "Whatever I can get." He looked at the shelf. "I was not much for schooling as a boy, but I have tried to make up the difference since." Pearl ran a finger along the spines. There was a battered copy of a historical survey of the American West, some agricultural texts, a Bible that looked genuinely read rather than just displayed, and a volume of poetry that sat at the end of the row slightly apart from the others, as if the owner was not entirely sure it belonged. "Whose poetry?" she asked. "Walt Whitman," Aaron said, and he looked slightly embarrassed, the way a large and competent man can look when he is caught in an unexpected tenderness. "I like Whitman," Pearl said. Aaron looked at her. "So do I," he said. They stood in the small cabin in the spring light coming through the single window, and Pearl thought about the 2 rooms at the north end of Main Street that she would need to vacate within the week. And she thought about Theodore's letter. And she thought about the way Aaron had stood on her doorstep the night before with his hat in his hands, and said, "I have tried to be a decent man," as if it were the plainest and most important fact he knew about himself. "If I say yes," Pearl said slowly, "it would need to be a real marriage." "Yes," Aaron said, without hesitation and without confusion about what she meant. "A real marriage, not an arrangement, not a business transaction dressed up in vows. 2 people building something together. I would want to go to Colorado in June as I had planned," Pearl said. "Theodore needs help and I will not abandon him because my circumstances have changed." "That is reasonable," Aaron said. "I can manage the land through the summer." "I would want to be consulted about decisions," Pearl said. "About the land, about the money, about what we build here." "I am not decoration, Mr. Abbott." "I know you are not, Miss Talbot," Aaron said. "I would not want you to be." Pearl looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her with that steady dark gaze that she was already starting to think of as something to navigate by, the way you use a fixed star. "All right," she said. "Yes." Aaron let out a breath, and she realized then how tightly he had been holding himself, and something about that undid a small, careful thing in her chest. "I will go to the preacher this afternoon," he said, "if that suits you." "It suits me," Pearl said. They were married 4 days later in the small Methodist church at the center of Caldwell, with the preacher and his wife, and the hotel owner Mrs. Clara Pruitt and Aaron's neighbor Jim Story and his wife Nora as witnesses. Pearl wore a blue dress she had made herself the previous autumn, which she had always liked, and Aaron wore a clean white shirt and his good coat, and had clearly made an attempt to tame his dark hair into some kind of order. He looked, Pearl thought as she walked toward him, like a man who was entirely serious about what he was doing and entirely glad of it. She felt the same way. The ceremony was brief and plain, the way both of them wanted it, and when the preacher said Aaron might kiss his bride, Aaron turned to her and took her hand first, and then kissed her once, gently and with great care, and Pearl found that her eyes had gone quite warm and bright. Afterward, Clara Pruitt had organized a small dinner at the hotel for the wedding party, which ran to 6 people, and a good roast chicken and 2 pies. And Jim Story told a long and somehow both funny and touching story about the time Aaron had spent an entire afternoon chasing a cow that had gotten out of the fence and ended up knee-deep in the creek, and everyone laughed, and Pearl watched Aaron laugh and thought, "I am going to be very glad I said yes." The next week was a kind of revelation. Pearl moved her things out to the cabin, which was an enterprise involving 2 wagon trips and the willing assistance of Nora Story, who was 35, and had the cheerful directness of a woman who has lived enough life to be past pretending she does not find things interesting. Nora helped Pearl hang curtains on the single window. Pearl had brought her sewing things, naturally, and told her the useful things about Aaron Abbott that a neighbor of 8 months had observed. "He works like the devil," Nora said, driving a nail with the back of a hatchet because it was what she had. "Sunrise to dark most days, but he does not work mean if you know what I mean. He is not angry at the land the way some men are. He seems to genuinely like it." "That is a good quality," Pearl said. "He is also," Nora said, "extremely private about himself, which I suspect you have already figured out and which I suspect you will be better at navigating than I was." She looked at Pearl with direct and friendly eyes. "He does not talk about what he is thinking unless he has decided to, but when he decides to, he means it." "Yes," Pearl said. "I think I know that." "Good," Nora said, and drove the nail home. Aaron, for his part, handled the strangeness of a woman suddenly living in his house with a kind of careful consideration that Pearl found both touching and slightly funny. He asked, the first evening, where she would prefer to put things, and then moved them to where she said without commentary. He asked if there were foods she did not like. He asked if the lamp kept her awake if he read late, and when she said no, he looked relieved in a way that suggested the lamp was important to him. The first 3 nights Pearl slept in the bunk, and Aaron slept on a bedroll on the floor, which they had agreed on without making it a production, because they were practical people who understood that trust is built in time. On the 4th night, Aaron had added a small lean-to addition to the cabin, working through the late afternoon in the long spring light, and made a room with a proper door for the 2 of them, with a real bed frame he had gotten from Jim Story, who had a spare, and Pearl had sewn a proper mattress cover and stuffed it with the best of the cotton batting she had brought with her. And that night they slept in the same bed properly for the first time, side by side in the new room with the smell of fresh-cut wood around them. Pearl did not sleep immediately. She lay on her side and listened to the creak and the night sounds and the steady quiet of Aaron's breathing beside her, and thought about the extraordinary fact that she was here, in this place, next to this man she had known for 10 days, and felt not afraid but full. As if something that had been missing for a long time had come back, the way circulation comes back into a hand that has been cold. Aaron spoke once, just as she was finally drifting. "Pearl," he said, and his voice in the dark was low and careful. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I am glad you said yes." "So am I," she said. She felt him settle more deeply into the mattress, a kind of releasing, and then they were both asleep. In the mornings, Pearl made breakfast while Aaron did the first round of chores, and they ate together at the table. And Pearl discovered that Aaron was the kind of man who was genuinely present at breakfast, not distracted or half-present but actually there, willing to talk or willing to be quiet, depending on what the day seemed to call for. She liked that enormously. Her father had always read the paper at breakfast and her mother had always talked to the papers back, and Pearl had grown up thinking that was just how mornings were. This was different. They talked about the garden, which was coming up well, and about the cabin's needs more room would be wanted, a second window, a proper root cellar before winter. Aaron had plans for all of it, sketched on the back of a flour bag in a surprisingly neat hand. Pearl added things to the plans, and he listened to her additions with the same attention he gave everything, and twice changed the layout based on what she said, and explained why in terms that showed he had thought her point through properly. On the 8th day, which was a Sunday, Pearl walked with Aaron down to the creek in the afternoon, and they sat on the bank in the shade of the cottonwoods, and Aaron told her the one thing about himself she had sensed was still held back. He had been in trouble as a young man, he said. Not serious trouble, not the kind that follows you, but enough. A fight in a border town that had gone badly wrong, resulting in a man with a broken arm and Aaron in a jail cell for a week. A stretch of 2 years where he had moved from job to job and place to place, and had not been honest with anyone, including himself, about what he was doing or who he was becoming. "I told you I have tried to be a decent man," he said. "I wanted you to know that it has been trying at certain points, that I have not always been who I am now." Pearl looked at the water moving over the stones. "Who you are now is who you decided to be," she said. "Yes," Aaron said. "Then that is what matters," Pearl said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached out and covered her hand with his, and Pearl turned her hand over and held on, and they sat like that for a while with the creek running and the cottonwoods talking above them in whatever language cottonwoods use, and Pearl felt the last of the strange formal distance between them dissolve like sugar in warm water. June came, and Pearl packed for Colorado. It was not easy to pack, which surprised her. 2 months ago, leaving Caldwell for the summer had seemed simple and obvious. Now she stood in the Lenta room folding dresses into her traveling bag and felt the weight of leaving in a way that was entirely new and not at all unpleasant. It was the weight of having something to come back to. Aaron drove her to the station at Wichita, which was a day's drive north, and they spent the night at a boarding house and had supper in a proper restaurant, which was the first time Pearl had been to a restaurant in 2 years. Aaron ordered the same thing as her because he said he had no strong opinions about the menu, and she seemed to have a better sense of these things, which made her laugh. After supper they walked along the river in the long June evening, and Aaron held her hand in a way that had become natural by now. Their palms fitted together with the ease of something practiced, and Pearl thought about Whitman's lines, something about being in love with the earth and the sky and the faces of people, and thought, yes, that is close to it, this feeling. At the station the next morning, Aaron held her properly and then stepped back and looked at her with his steady dark eyes. "Right," he said. "Every week," Pearl said. "If Theodore needs you longer, I will come home in September," Pearl said firmly. "We have a root cellar to dig." That made him smile, the quick, unguarded one. "We do," he said. She got on the train and she did not cry, though her throat was tight all the way out of Wichita, and she did not fully relax until the Kansas plains were rolling past the window and she could think clearly again. And what she thought clearly was, "I am in love with my husband." It was a revelation, and not a revelation. It had been building in her from the beginning, from the moment she had led him into the kitchen for coffee and he had sat at her table and looked at her like she was something real and significant and worth talking to. But she had not put the word to it yet, had been treating it carefully, as if naming it too soon might change it. She named it now, looking out at the Kansas sky, and it held up fine. Better than fine. Colorado in June was something Pearl had not been prepared for, and she arrived in Pueblo to find Theodore thinner than she remembered but heartened to see her. And the house, a proper house, much larger than the cabin, with a garden of its own and a view of the mountains that stopped Pearl on the doorstep for a full minute before she could speak. "The mountains," she said. "Yes," Theodore said, with the fond exasperation of a man who has been trying to write to his family about the mountains and knows that words do not cover it. "They take some getting used to." They did not take Pearl long to get used to. She loved them almost immediately, and with an uncomplicated joy that she found refreshing. Theodore was not as ill as she had feared, but he was genuinely diminished, and the doctor had been right that he needed someone to manage the house and help with the correspondence from the claim, which was producing enough income that it required real record-keeping. Pearl proved excellent at the record-keeping, having kept careful accounts for herself for years, and within 2 weeks had organized Theodore's financial papers into a state that made him look at her with something close to awe. "Your mother kept accounts like this," he said. "I had forgotten." "She was very good at it," Pearl said. "You are better," Theodore said. "Do not tell her I said that." Pearl felt the gentle ache of that. Her mother had been gone 2 years, but the casual way Theodore referenced her as if she might be in the next room was somehow both painful and comforting. "I will not tell her," she said, playing along. She wrote to Aaron every Sunday, as promised, long letters full of the mountains and the weather and Theodore's improvements and the small daily observations that had become, she realized, the primary way she organized her thoughts. She wrote about a fox she had seen in the garden 3 mornings in a row, and the peculiar way it sat and regarded her as if she were the one trespassing. She wrote about a recipe Theodore's housekeeper had taught her for green chili that she intended to try to replicate in Kansas, though she doubted the chilies would cooperate. She wrote that she missed the cottonwoods and the creek. She did not write, for the first few weeks, that she missed him, because she was not entirely sure how to say it without it sounding excessive or embarrassing. Aaron's letters back were shorter, because he was not a natural writer, but they were precise and warm in their way. He wrote about the garden in practical terms. The beans were up, the corn was setting well, the tomatoes wanted watching for beetle. He wrote that Jim's story had helped him pour the concrete for the root cellar floor and that it had set well. He wrote that the brown horse, whose name turned out to be Fletcher, he had not thought to mention the horse had a name before, had thrown a shoe and been to the farrier and was fine. Then one letter, about 6 weeks in, had a different paragraph at the end, set apart from the rest. I find I am not entirely used to you not being here yet. I am not certain I will be before September. That is meant as a good thing, in case it does not read that way. Pearl read that paragraph 3 times and then once more, and then sat down and wrote the letter she had been working up to, the one that told him plainly that she was looking forward to September with a level of anticipation that she would have thought excessive if she tried to explain it to anyone else, but that she suspected he might understand. She also wrote, "I love you." She had decided that if she was going to say it, she was going to say it plainly and not dress it up in so many qualifications that it lost its shape. She sent the letter on a Sunday morning and then went to sit in the garden with her coffee and watched the mountains in their extraordinary silence and thought about a man in Kansas with dark, steady eyes and a book of Whitman on his shelf, and felt entirely and blessedly happy. His next letter took 11 days to arrive, which was longer than usual, and when it did it was 1 sentence longer than his normal letters. The sentence said, "I love you too, and I am glad one of us had the courage to say it first." The Colorado summer was good and full and productive. Theodore's lungs improved steadily once Pearl was managing the house and making sure he did not push himself past what was sensible, and by August, he was well enough to take short rides up into the foothills on his old mare. He talked more than he had before, about the claim and about his years in Colorado, and about the Talbot family history that Pearl had only ever gotten in fragments. He talked about Pearl's father as a young man, full of plans and restlessness, and about her mother as a girl, the best horseback rider in their county in Tennessee, and Pearl gathered these stories like water and kept them. Theodore also, gently and without pressure, asked her about Aaron. Pearl told him. She told him more than she had expected to, sitting on the porch in the evening with the mountains going rose and then violet in the setting sun, and Theodore listened with the particular quality of attention that Pearl recognized as a family trait, the same thing she had watched in Aaron, and that she suspected she also had a willingness to actually hear what is being said before deciding what to make of it. "He sounds like a man worth having," Theodore said when she was done. "He is," Pearl said. "Are you happy, Pearl?" She considered this with the same care she gave everything. "Yes," she said. "Actually and genuinely yes, in a way I did not expect to be at this point in my life." Theodore nodded. "Good," he said, with the simple finality of a man who asked because he needed to know and now he knows and is satisfied. "Good." September came with a change in the Colorado air, a coolness that crept in at night and gave the mornings a particular sharpness, and Pearl found herself packing her traveling bag with a sense of completeness rather than leave-taking. She had done what she came to do. Theodore was well and organized and had a neighbor, a widow named Frances Holt, who had begun coming by twice a week in August with pies and conversation, with the thoughtful regularity of a woman who has noticed a man who might need looking after. Pearl had noticed Mrs. Holt noticing Theodore, and had mentioned this to him on her last evening in Pueblo, and Theodore had turned a color she had not seen on an adult man before, and said that he did not know what she was talking about, which Pearl translated accurately as he absolutely did know what she was talking about. "She is a good woman," Pearl said, and you are not as old as you think you are." Theodore said nothing, but he looked out at the mountains with the particular expression of a man who is trying very hard not to smile. Pearl took the train back from Pueblo to Wichita in the second week of September, and this time, the planes rolling past the window produced in her an entirely different feeling than they had in June. Not goodbye, but hello. The great empty Kansas sky welcoming her back in its vast and indifferent way, and she thought that perhaps all beauty was like the mountains, waiting to be gotten used to, and that the getting used to was itself a kind of gift. Aaron was at the Wichita station. She had not told him she was arriving on this particular train, only that she would be back in the second week of September, and so she did not expect him, and her heart did something thorough and involuntary when she stepped down from the car and saw him standing at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hand, scanning the crowd. He saw her at almost the same moment, and his face did the thing it did when he was not managing it, the quick, unguarded change, the smile that was not careful. She walked through the crowd to him, and he met her halfway, and then she was standing in front of him, and he was looking at her with the dark, steady eyes, and she thought, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, and I do not think I will get tired of that look. "You are here," she said. "I drove up yesterday," Aaron said. "I thought I would rather be early than late." "You drove up yesterday," Pearl repeated, and something in her chest was warm and pressing. "Aaron." "I know," he said, slightly rueful. "I was not certain I could wait another day." Pearl laughed, which was not the sophisticated response but was the true one, and then Aaron's arms came around her and she put her face against his shoulder and stayed there for a moment in the middle of the Wichita station platform with people moving around them, and it felt like coming home. Not like coming home to a place, exactly, but coming home to a person, which she was beginning to understand was different and more important. He pulled back and looked at her face. "How is Theodore?" "Better," Pearl said, "much better, and possibly falling in love with his neighbor, but he will not admit it yet." Aaron smiled. "Good man." "He is," Pearl said. They stayed the night in Wichita again, at the same boarding house, and over supper Pearl told Aaron about the mountains and the record-keeping and the fox in the garden and Mrs. Holt's pies, and Aaron told her about the root cellar and the harvest, and the fact that Fletcher had knocked over an entire section of fence in a bid for freedom and spent a night in Jim Story's corn before being retrieved. "Fletcher has opinions," Aaron said. "I have noticed that about Fletcher," Pearl said. They talked for hours, easy and unhurried, filling in the months, and Pearl noticed that the conversation had a quality now that it had not had in the spring, a completeness, a shorthand that had developed, the way language develops between people who have been paying close attention to each other. She would start a thought and he would follow it. He would begin a sentence and she would finish it, sometimes correctly and sometimes hilariously wrongly, which was even better. It was very late when they finally went up to bed, and lying in the dark in the Wichita boarding house with September rain just beginning on the roof, Aaron said, quietly and with absolute certainty, "I missed you." "I missed you," Pearl said. "The mountains were beautiful, but they were not you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Pearl, yes. I would like to talk about the future." He meant this in the practical way, the plans on flour bags way, but also in the larger way underneath it. She could hear both. "So would I," she said. "Tomorrow let us sleep first." "Yes," he said. "All right." They slept, and in the morning the rain had cleared and the sky over Wichita was the precise blue of September at its best, and over breakfast they talked about the future. They talked about the cabin and the plans for expanding it, a second room, a real bedroom, a proper kitchen extension. They talked about the garden and what to plant next year. Aaron mentioned, carefully, that he thought the land could support some cattle, not a herd, but a small one, enough to supplement the garden income. Pearl said she thought that was a good idea and asked about the fencing costs, and they worked through the numbers together at the table, Aaron's handwriting on the back of a menu and Pearl's sharper mind for arithmetic catching the places where he had been slightly optimistic. And then Pearl said, in the same practical voice she had used for the fencing costs, "I would like children, Aaron, when we are ready, when the house is bigger and the finances are steadier." Aaron put down his pencil. He looked at her across the table. "So would I," he said. "Very much." "Good," Pearl said. "Then we agree." She picked up the pencil and handed it back to him, and they went back to the fencing costs, and underneath the table Aaron's foot was pressed against hers, warm and steady, and stayed there for the rest of breakfast. The drive back to Caldwell took most of the day, and they arrived in the late afternoon with the harvest light lying golden across everything. The creek, the cottonwoods, the cabin on its slight rise with the new root cellar door visible, and the garden laid out in its orderly autumn rows, the corn stalks dried to bronze and the bean poles bare. Pearl stood in the wagon looking at it all and felt something settle in her with a solidity that she recognized, finally, as permanent. This was hers. This was theirs. Not by accident or desperation, but by a choice made on a May evening when a man had stood at her door with his hat in his hands and offered her something different from what she had been afraid was the only option. She had chosen right. The next 2 years were the building years, and Pearl would remember them later as the best kind of hard, the kind where you are tired at the end of every day because you have done something real. Aaron expanded the cabin through the autumn and winter of that first year, adding the bedroom and the kitchen extension, and Pearl helped where she could and directed where she couldn't and sewed curtains for every new window. Jim Story and Nora came to help with the heavy work, and it became a kind of tradition, the 4 of them working through a Saturday, and Nora bringing a pot of something wonderful for the midday meal, and everyone talking about everything under the wide Kansas sky. Aaron bought 4 cows in the spring of his second year on the land, and the small herd grew carefully and steadily, and the income from the milk and the cream gave them a stability that the garden alone had not quite managed. Pearl took on some sewing commissions again, not from necessity now, but because she liked it, and because the money went into a savings account that Aaron had set up at the Caldwell Bank, and watching that account grow was one of Pearl's private satisfactions. Harlan Webb had not been gracious about losing Pearl to Aaron Abbott. In the months after the wedding, he had made a few pointed remarks about the Abbott land when Aaron was in town, the kind of remarks designed to be overheard, questioning the quality of the soil and the sense of the enterprise. Aaron had heard them and had said nothing and had gone home and planted things, which was the best possible response, Pearl thought. The land's results spoke plainly enough. By the second summer, nobody was making remarks. Webb sold most of his Caldwell properties in the autumn of 1879 and moved to Wichita, which was a relief to several people besides Pearl. The winter of 1879 was hard, a blizzard in January that kept them inside for 4 days and tested the cabin's new walls, which held admirably. And Pearl and Aaron spent those 4 days in a way that she would not have thought possible on that May evening 14 months ago, when she had been a woman alone in a 2-room house with a rent notice and a letter from Colorado. They read aloud to each other. They played cards. They had long, wandering conversations about things that had nothing to do with the farm and everything to do with what they thought and believed and wondered about. Aaron talked about history with the genuine passion of a self-taught man who has found something that feeds him, and Pearl talked about the nature of fairness and what the West owed to the people it had taken the land from, which was a thing she had been thinking about since Theodore's descriptions of the displacement of the Ute people near his Colorado land. And Aaron listened seriously and said he thought she was right, that the displacement had been a profound injustice, that history would not look kindly on it, and that it was not enough to simply note the wrong if you could do something more. "What can we do?" Pearl asked, not rhetorically but seriously. Aaron thought about it. "Be honest about it," he said. "Not pretend it did not happen. If I meet people who have been dispossessed, treat them as people, not as a problem or a curiosity." He paused. "It is not enough, but it is not nothing." Pearl nodded. "No," she said, "it is not nothing." It was one of the conversations she would think about for a long time afterward, not because they had solved anything. They had not, and she knew it, but because of the quality of it, the willingness to sit with something difficult and think about it honestly rather than dismissing it because it was easier. She loved him very much. She told him so during that blizzard week, more freely than she had in the letter, with the directness that came from 9 months of genuine partnership. He was sitting across the table from her reading something, and she was sewing and looked up at him in the lamplight, big and quiet and absorbed in his book, and she said, "I love you, Aaron." He looked up. The lamp caught the dark of his eyes. "I love you, Pearl," he said, with such simplicity and certainty that it was like a fact of the natural world, the way the creek runs east, the way the cottonwoods come into leaf in May. Then he went back to his book and she went back to her sewing, and the blizzard pressed against the windows and the stove ticked and the cabin held, and Pearl thought, yes, this is the life, this particular configuration of things, this man at this table in this light. Yes. In the spring of 1880, Pearl discovered she was pregnant. She told Aaron in the way she told him most important things directly, without preamble, sitting at the breakfast table. She said, "I think we are going to have a baby in October." Aaron set down his coffee cup with great care. He looked at her. His face went through several things rapidly, and then settled on something that was not quite a word Pearl had a name for, something between joy and solemnity and wonder, the face of a man encountering something larger than he had prepared for. "October," he said. "October," Pearl confirmed. "Pearl," he said, and then did not say anything else, but he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and they sat like that for a while with the May morning coming through the kitchen window and the birds at considerable volume outside, and the garden growing and the cows making their peaceful commentary from the field. And Pearl felt the extraordinary weight and lightness of the moment, the way it held everything that had happened to get here, the letter from Theodore, the knock at her door. The night she had not slept, the choice she had made, the man across the table with his big warm hands covering hers. "Are you well?" Aaron asked at last, with the practical tenderness that was one of her favorite things about him. "Very well," Pearl said, "though I would like more crackers kept in the house if you do not mind." He got crackers that afternoon. Through the spring and summer of 1880, Pearl's pregnancy was, she felt, not a sufficiently dramatic narrative. She was healthy and the baby moved well, and she continued to work through most of it, slightly more slowly as the summer heat arrived, and Aaron's management of the alarm he felt about this was a study in careful self-restraint. He did not try to stop her from working, because he understood her need for usefulness, but he found consistent and fairly transparent ways to make sure she had help or rest when needed, and Pearl found his transparent maneuvering both evident and entirely dear to her. Nora's story was magnificent. She had had 3 children of her own, and she took Pearl's pregnancy with the calm authority of a woman who has navigated this territory and knows where the difficult places are. She came by twice a week and talked with great practical frankness about what to expect, what was normal, what was not, and what to do in each case, and Pearl absorbed this information with the same thoroughness she brought to the farm accounts. Letters came from Theodore through the summer, increasingly cheerful and increasingly peppered with mentions of Francis Holt, whom he now referred to simply as Francis, which Pearl noted and was very pleased about. In August, Theodore wrote that he and Francis were to be married in October, and would Pearl and her husband consider making the journey to Pueblo for the wedding. Pearl wrote back that they would be delighted, though they might be slightly delayed, as she was expecting their first child in mid-October and could not be certain of the timing. Theodore wrote back a response of considerable emotional incoherence that Pearl translated as, "I am overjoyed, I cannot believe it, please be careful, and I will wait to see you whenever is possible." The baby came on the 4th of October, 3 weeks before Theodore's wedding, and it was a boy. Aaron had wanted a boy. In the quiet way he wanted things, which meant he had not said so because he would have been equally glad of a girl and did not want Pearl to feel that any particular outcome was preferred. Pearl had known anyway. She knew him well enough by now. They named the baby James after Aaron's father, which made Aaron go very still when she suggested it, and then say yes with the kind of conviction that was close to something else. James Abbott came into the world on a cool October morning with Nora Story and the Caldwell doctor both present, and he announced himself with a voice that suggested he had strong opinions about the transition. And Aaron held him 20 minutes after he was born with the expression of a man who has just understood something previously theoretical. Pearl, tired and profoundly happy, watched Aaron hold their son and thought about the May evening 2.5 years ago, the doorstep, the hat in the hands, the offer of something different. She thought, look at where different brought us. Aaron looked up from the baby and caught her watching him, and his expression was so unguarded and full and entirely his, the steady eyes gone soft and the careful face gone open, that Pearl felt her throat close with the good kind of pain. "He is perfect," Aaron said. "He is," Pearl agreed. "He has your jaw." Aaron looked at the baby's jaw. "God help him," he said, which made Pearl laugh through the tears she had not noticed starting. They did make it to Theodore's wedding in November, driving out when James was 6 weeks old, and Pearl deemed the journey possible. The four of them in the wagon with extra blankets, and a fortified travel box of supplies that Aaron had packed with the thoroughness of a man planning a military campaign. It was a 3-day drive to the train, and then the train to Pueblo, and James was opinionated about portions of it, but generally managed the journey with the adaptability of a baby whose parents were practical people. Theodore and Frances were married on a Saturday in November in Pueblo, with the mountains watching, sharp and snow-touched now at their peaks, and Pearl stood up with Theodore and held James on one hip, and Frances had her daughter as her maid of honor. And afterward there was a dinner at the house that Frances had catered with the help of 2 women from the church, and which was magnificent. Theodore held James after dinner and looked at him with the expression of a man who is discovering, at the age of 53, that he would like to be an uncle in the active sense of the word. "I want him to know the mountains," Theodore said. "He will," Pearl said. "We will come back." Frances joined them, a small and warm and direct woman who reminded Pearl in certain ways of Nora Story in her no-nonsense quality, and she looked at James with uncomplicated pleasure, and said he was a beautiful boy, and asked Pearl every practical question about the birth and the recovery with the straightforwardness of a woman who does not see the use in pretending the body is mysterious, when it is actually just requiring accurate information. Pearl liked her enormously. Aaron and Theodore sat together after dinner, and Pearl watched them from across the room, her husband and her uncle, talking with the slightly tentative quality of 2 men who have not had the chance to really know each other and are discovering they might like to. Aaron was telling Theodore something about the land. She could tell from the way his hands were moving, the slight sketch of topography, and Theodore was listening with genuine attention. She thought, "My family." It was a complete and extraordinary thought. They went home to Kansas in December, and the winter was cold but well provisioned, the root cellar full, the firewood stacked, the small herd housed in the shed Aaron had built the previous spring, and James grew with the baffling speed of the very young, and Pearl watched Aaron become a father with a kind of continuous, low-grade wonder at the entirety of it. Aaron was not a demonstrative man in the public way, but with James he was different. He was patient and consistent and warm, and he talked to the baby from the beginning in a normal, sensible voice, explaining things. The names of tools, the names of plants, the behavior of cattle, the mechanics of the stove with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, as if the infant's inability to yet understand was simply a temporary condition to be addressed through consistent information. Pearl had to leave the room occasionally because she did not want him to see her crying. One March evening, when James was 5 months old and Aaron was sitting in the chair by the fire with the baby asleep on his chest and a book open in his other hand, not reading it but just resting his hand on it, Pearl looked at them from the kitchen doorway and thought, "I am going to remember this. Specifically and exactly, I am going to carry this image with me for the rest of my life. The chair by the fire, the book, the sleeping baby, the man. Aaron looked up and saw her watching, and he raised his eyebrows slightly in the question that was not a question, "Are you all right?" Pearl smiled, which was the answer that was not an answer more than all right. Entirely, completely, permanently all right. Aaron smiled back, the quick one, and went back to his book, and James slept on his chest, and the fire burned, and outside the March wind ran across the Kansas plains looking for something to argue with, and found the cabin and found it solid. The spring of 1881 brought new growth in every direction. The herd was now 7 cows, and Aaron had begun talking carefully about a horse breeding operation, small to start, which he had knowledge of from his Texas years, and which Pearl's arithmetic suggested could be significantly profitable if managed well. They had lengthy discussions about it over many evenings and wrote several pages of calculations, and eventually agreed to try it on a small scale, purchasing 2 mares in addition to Fletcher, who was not a prime breeding horse but whose personality suggested that any offspring might have interesting opinions. James took his first steps in April, on a warm morning in the garden, which felt appropriate to Pearl in some unnameable way. He walked 4 steps toward a bean pole, and then sat down hard and looked at what he had done with an expression of complete astonishment. Aaron, who had been fixing fence nearby, dropped everything and came at a run when Pearl called out, and arrived in time to see James pull himself up and do it again. 4 steps, Pearl said. That was 6 steps, Aaron said. 4, Pearl said. I counted, Aaron said. You ran from 40 feet away and arrived at step 3, Pearl said. I saw all of them. It was 4. Aaron looked at James, who was now sitting in the garden dirt with no particular opinion about the debate. 4, Aaron conceded. Thank you, Pearl said. She wrote to Theodore that evening with the news, and Theodore wrote back 2 weeks later with a long and warmly worded letter that included, at the end, news of his own. Francis was expecting. At 53, Theodore wrote, he had not thought this possible, and Francis had expressed, in terms he did not fully reproduce in the letter, a somewhat philosophical view of the surprise, and they were both finding their way to being delighted about it. Pearl read this letter twice, laughing softly to herself, and then read it to Aaron over breakfast. And Aaron said with great dignity that Theodore was clearly a man of considerable personal resources, which made Pearl laugh so hard that James stared at her from his place on the floor with an expression of serious concern. The horse operation took shape through the summer and into the fall of 1881, and the first 2 foals were born in the spring of 1882, which also happened to be the spring that Pearl discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Aaron in the same way she had told him the first time, over breakfast, directly. His response was the same, the careful setting down of the coffee cup, the direct look, the reach for hands, but with an additional quality underneath it now, the confidence of a man who has done this once and knows the shape of the joy. When he asked, November, Pearl said. Good, Aaron said, after the last of the harvest. I thought you would appreciate the timing, Pearl said dryly. He smiled. I appreciate many things about you, he said, including my tendency to schedule pregnancies around the agricultural calendar, Pearl said. Including everything, Aaron said, with such simple and total sincerity that Pearl's dry tone vanished immediately. The second child, born on a gray November morning with rain on the windows and James playing elaborate mysteries with a set of wooden blocks in the main room, was another boy. They named him Thomas, after Pearl's father, and Pearl held him in the same room where James had been born 2 years before, and felt the extraordinary continuity of it, the way life builds itself deliberately in a place you have chosen. Thomas was different from James from the beginning, quieter, more watchful, with a gravity in his dark eyes that Aaron said was familiar, and Pearl laughed and said she was not going to say whose eyes those were because she did not want anyone to get a large head. James's response to Thomas was measured and scientific. He examined the new baby with the focused attention of a 2-year-old who has been told something important and is trying to verify the claim, and then announced his assessment to Aaron in 3 carefully selected words. Baby, small, mine. Not entirely wrong, Aaron said. Worrying in the long term, Pearl said. By the time James was 3 and Thomas was 1, the Abbott farm, which people in Caldwell had begun calling simply the Abbott place, with the particular tone of local regard, was a going concern in every real sense. The horse operation was producing well. Aaron had a natural eye for quality stock and a reputation that brought buyers from as far as Wichita and occasionally from the cattle operations further south. The kitchen garden had become a proper kitchen and market garden, larger and more diverse than it had started. The cabin had become, through 3 successive expansions, a genuine farmhouse with 4 rooms and a front porch that Pearl had made into her own particular province, with 2 chairs and a view of the creek. Pearl had also, quietly and without making a project of it, established herself as a resource for the other women in the area around Caldwell, the farm wives, the young women newly arrived from the East who were trying to understand what they had come to, the occasional woman in difficult circumstances who needed practical help and honest information. She kept her sewing commissions partly for the income, and partly because the women who came to her for sewing sometimes needed something besides sewing, and she was good at recognizing which was which. She had helped 2 women leave situations that were not safe for them, connecting them with people who could assist them in getting elsewhere, and she had done this without publicity or drama, because that was how it needed to be done. Aaron knew and approved, and once on a cold evening drove a woman and her 3 children 20 miles east to a different town himself without being asked, which Pearl found out about afterward from Nora's story, and which she mentioned to him the next morning. You could have told me, she said. It was handled, Aaron said. Aaron, he looked at her. She was afraid, he said. She did not need more people knowing. He paused. I told Jim after. That was enough. Pearl looked at him across the kitchen and thought, decent man, trying to be a decent man, succeeding at it more often than he gives himself credit for. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me, Aaron said. It was the right thing. I can thank you for doing the right thing, Pearl said. The right thing deserves acknowledgement. He considered this. All right, he said. You are welcome. The winter of 1883 brought a letter from Theodore with news that was equal parts astonishing and wonderful. Frances had given birth to a daughter the previous October, whom they had named Clara, and at 54 Theodore was a father and doing extremely well with it, by his own account, and Frances's account, and Clara's account, which was not articulate yet but ran to a great deal of apparent enthusiasm about her father. Pearl wrote back a letter that she was not entirely composed while writing, because the image of Theodore at 54, who had been a confirmed bachelor for his entire adult life, now holding a baby daughter with the same expression she had seen on Aaron when James was born, that image was so exactly the right kind of happy that it was almost too much. Aaron read the letter and said that Theodore clearly had a talent for late starts. Like us, Pearl said. We were not late, Aaron said. I was 24 when I met you, Pearl said. Some people would call that late. Some people, Aaron said, would be wrong. Spring 1883 found the Abbott place at its best, the early crops up, the mares in foal, the 2 boys running between the garden rows with the total disregard for planted things that small children have, and Aaron replanting the sections they had visited in their run, with an equanimity that Pearl found admirable. James was 3, and already trying to follow Aaron on every task with the single-minded focus of a child who has decided what he is going to be when he grows up. Thomas was 1, and still conducting his careful scientific examination of the world from close range. Pearl sat on the front porch one late May evening, the light going gold and the air warm and smelling of turned earth and the creek, and listened to Aaron talking to James in the garden, explaining which plants were which with the serious thoroughness he always brought to explanation, and James asking why after every sentence, why do tomatoes need stakes? Why do beans climb? Why does corn grow taller? And Aaron answering each why with the same patient attention, until James apparently ran out of whys, and they were just quiet together in the garden in the evening light. Pearl thought about the letter that had come from Pueblo that morning. Theodore wrote to say that Clara had just said her first word, which had been the Spanish word for moon luna, because their housekeeper spoke to her often in Spanish, and Clara had apparently found this word most satisfying. Theodore found this very funny and also very beautiful, and Francis, he wrote, had declared it the best first word in the history of first words, and he was not inclined to disagree. Pearl was not inclined to disagree either. She thought about the moon and about Colorado mountains, and about a fox in a garden 3 mornings in a row. She thought about a smeared letter in flour-dusted hands and a knock on a door on a May evening 5 years ago. She thought about a man saying, "I have tried to be a decent man," as if it were the simplest fact in the world, and the way that simplicity had been the most compelling thing she had ever heard. Aaron came up the porch steps with James on his back, James's hands full of pulled-up weeds that he was presenting as gifts, and set James down carefully before settling into the other chair. James immediately presented Pearl with the weeds, which she accepted with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you," she said. "These are very fine. From the garden," James said. "I can see that," Pearl said. James, satisfied, went inside to find Thomas, who was presumably not going anywhere but was considered by James to require regular checking. Aaron leaned back in his chair and looked at the last of the light on the creek. Pearl looked at his profile, familiar and dear, the strong jaw and the quiet eyes and the slight graying at his temples that had started in the past year, and which she thought suited him very well. "I was thinking," Pearl said, "about the evening you came to my door." Aaron turned his head and looked at her. "I was thinking about what might have happened if you had not," Pearl said, "if you had known about Webb's proposal and decided it was not your business." Aaron was quiet for a moment. "I thought about that," he said, "for about 3 minutes, then I thought about you and I stopped thinking about it." "You thought about me," Pearl said. "You hardly knew me." "I knew enough," Aaron said. "I told you that." "You did," Pearl said. "I was skeptical at the time." "Were you?" "I was also not skeptical," Pearl admitted. "That was the confusing part." Aaron smiled. "I was terrified," he said, "in case you were wondering. Standing there with my hat in my hands, rehearsing what I was going to say the whole ride into town, and then forgetting all of it the moment you opened the door." Pearl laughed. "You did not seem terrified." "I was very committed to not seeming terrified," Aaron said. "It took considerable effort." Pearl reached across and covered his hand with hers, the same gesture he had used that morning at the breakfast table 5 years ago when she told him about James. He turned his hand over and held hers. "I am glad," Pearl said. "I am very, very glad you knocked." "So am I," Aaron said. The creek ran in its soft, perpetual commentary below them. The last birds of the evening went through the cottonwoods in a burst of sound, and then settled. The sky was going from rose to lavender to the first deep blue of a Kansas night, and in a few minutes the stars would come out with their extraordinary Kansas abundance, more stars than a person raised in a city could quite believe. Inside, James's voice and Thomas's voice went back and forth in the language of brothers that was half words and half something else, and the smell of the supper Pearl had left simmering on the stove drifted out through the kitchen window. Aaron's hand was warm in hers. Pearl looked at the sky and thought, 5 years. She thought about the woman who had stood in her flour-dusted kitchen holding a smeared letter, calculating how little money she had, afraid and tired and trying not to show it. She thought about that woman with tremendous affection and something like gratitude, because that woman had made good choices in a hard moment, and those choices had led here, to this porch, this man, this sky, these 2 small boys rearranging the inside of the house. She thought about Harlan Webb, wherever he was in Wichita, and found she had no particular feeling about him at all, which seemed like the right amount. She thought about Theodore holding his daughter Clara under the Colorado sky, and about Francis who made pies and had strong opinions about accurate information, and about the mountains that were still there, exactly as high, waiting to be visited again. She thought about the injustice that was woven into the land they were sitting on, the displacement that had made it available, and felt the same unresolved weight of it she always felt. The knowledge that being honest about it and treating people decently was not enough but was what she could do, and that she would keep doing it, and that her sons would learn to do it too, because that was the work of a life, and it did not end. She thought about Aaron at 30, standing on her doorstep with everything to lose and nothing guaranteed, offering her something real. She thought about herself at 24, opening the door. "Aaron," she said, "yes, build me another room next spring." He looked at her. The steady dark eyes went through the same rapid calculation they always did when she said something unexpected, and then settled, and she watched the moment he understood. He was quiet for a moment. "November again," he said at last. "October, I think," Pearl said, "give or take." Aaron's hand tightened on hers. "A girl this time," he said, not as a demand but as a hope offered lightly. "Perhaps," Pearl said. "We will see what comes." "Whatever comes," Aaron said. "Whatever comes," Pearl agreed. The first stars appeared above the cottonwoods, faint and then brighter, and the Kansas night laid itself gently over the farm and the creek and the garden and the good solid house that had been built by careful hands. And the man and the woman on the porch sat in the growing dark with their hands held together, and the sound of their children inside, and the smell of supper on the air. And everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built. And the life they had chosen, both of them, fully and freely, on a May evening that had started with fear and ended with something else entirely, was exactly, precisely, permanently theirs.